The stagecoach left her standing in the dust like something broken. Copper Bend, Montana territory. July of 1878. Heat that made the air shimmer above the dirt road and turned every breath into something heavy and reluctant. The wooden platform of the depot creaked beneath her boots, warped and splitting from years of sun and neglect, and the stagecoach that had carried her away from the man who was supposed to become her husband was already disappearing into the white glare of the afternoon, trailing a cloud of ochre dust that hung in the still air like a slow exhale. Eliza Thornton stood beside her trunk and watched it go. 23 years old, alone, $4 in her coin purse, and not a single soul within 1,000 miles who knew her name or cared whether she lived or died. The dress she wore, white cotton with lace at the collar and small pearl buttons down the back, had been fresh and pressed when she boarded the coach in Boston 6 weeks ago. Now it was wrinkled and road-stained, the hem brown with dust, and there was a small tear near the left sleeve where it had caught on a nail during one of the rough overnight stops between Missouri and Montana. She had sewn it shut with thread pulled from her petticoat, but the mend was visible. If you look closely, a crooked little line of stitches that told the truth about the woman wearing the dress. She was coming apart at the seams, and she was trying her best to hold herself together. The trunk sat beside her on the platform. Heavy, impossibly heavy. It was not filled with the things a bride was supposed to bring west. No fine china wrapped in cotton, no grandmother's quilt, no silver candlesticks or embroidered linens. The trunk held 27 books, mathematics through calculus, Greek philosophy in the original language, Latin poetry, a volume of Shakespeare so worn the spine had been reglued twice, 3 notebooks filled with her own handwriting equations and translations, and the beginning of what she had once hoped might become a paper on applied geometry. And beneath the books, folded carefully, a diploma from the Boston Academy for Young Women, signed by the headmistress herself, declaring that Eliza Thornton had completed the full course of study with distinction. That diploma was the reason she was standing here now, alone in a town she had never seen, in a territory she had never imagined visiting, with nothing ahead of her and nothing behind her, and the hot wind blowing grit into her eyes. 3 days. That was all the time it had taken. She had arrived at Virgil Kincaid's ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, stepping down from the hired wagon with her heart hammering and her hands clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked along the road because she thought it might make a good impression. Kincaid had placed an advertisement in the Boston Herald. She remembered every word because she had read it 40 times, tracing the letters with her finger late at night in her narrow room at the academy. Seeking an educated bride of good character, must be literate and well-read. A woman of intelligence and refinement to help build a life of culture on the frontier. It had seemed like a miracle. A man in the West who wanted exactly what she was. A man who valued the mind she had spent years building. Penny by penny, candle by candle, late nights hunched over textbooks while other girls her age were attending dances and learning to flirt. She had written to him. He had written back. His letters were short but seemed sincere, and she had filled in the gaps with hope, imagining a man who would sit with her by the fire discussing Euclid and Homer, a man who would see her education not as a burden, but as a gift. The man who met her at his ranch gate was not that man. Virgil Kincaid was 42 years old, thick through the middle, with small, calculating eyes set deep in a face that had the permanent flush of a man who drank whiskey before noon. He looked at her when she stepped down from the wagon, looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he is considering buying, and she saw his expression shift from anticipation to something cold and disappointed. He did not take her hand. He did not welcome her. He looked at her figure, her round, soft face, her full hips beneath the white dress, and his mouth tightened into a thin line. By that evening, she understood. He did not want an educated wife. He wanted a woman who could read his newspaper to him aloud while he ate breakfast, who could write his letters for him and add up his accounts, and who would do all of this quietly, obediently, without ever offering an opinion or correction. When Eliza noticed an error in his ledger book during supper, a simple arithmetic mistake that was costing him money, and pointed it out politely, Kincaid's face went dark. When she asked the following morning why women were not permitted to sit at the dining table when ranch hands were present, he stood up so abruptly his chair fell backward. On the third day, he told her to pack her trunk. His last words to her, spoken loudly enough for the housekeeper and 2 ranch hands to hear, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who had never once considered that his words might wound, because he had never once considered that the person he was speaking to was fully human. I needed a wife, not a fat school marm. You are too heavy and too full of opinions. No man out here wants that. He paid for her return passage, a one-way ticket back to Copper Bend. He did not offer to pay her fare to Boston. He did not ask where she would go. He simply put her back on the stagecoach, like a piece of merchandise that had failed to meet specifications, and she had sat in that rattling coach for 3 hours with her back straight and her jaw locked shut, refusing to cry in front of the driver, refusing to give Virgil Kincaid even the invisible satisfaction of her tears. But now the coach was gone, and the depot platform was empty except for her and the trunk, and the depot manager was a thin, sour man with tobacco stains on his chin who had just informed her that the depot closed in 1 hour and she needed to move her belongings. Eliza gripped the leather handle and pulled. The trunk moved perhaps 2 feet before the weight of 27 books in the sum total of her education and her broken future dragged it to a stop. Her arm burned. Her shoulder screamed. She readjusted her grip, set her feet, and pulled again. Another foot. She was breathing hard now, sweat running down her temples and dampening the collar of her dress, and she could feel people watching. A woman selling bread from a cart whispered something to the man beside her, and Eliza caught the words, "the returned bride," and the low, unkind sound of laughter that followed. She pulled again. The trunk did not move. Her hand slipped on the leather and she stumbled, nearly falling, catching herself on the edge of the platform with one palm while the other clutched the handle uselessly. She would not cry. She would not. That trunk is too heavy for one person. The voice came from behind her, deep, unhurried, stating a fact rather than asking a question. Eliza straightened and turned around. And then she looked up, and kept looking up. 3 men stood on the platform behind her, and her first thought, irrational and disorienting, was that the heat had finally gotten to her, and she was seeing triple. They were enormous. Each one stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the entire width of the platform, and they shared the same face, the same square jaw, the same high, sharp cheekbones, the same unusual eyes, the color of whiskey held up to lamplight, set beneath strong brows and shadowed by wide-brimmed hats stained dark with sweat. Their hair was the same shade of chestnut brown, streaked lighter by the sun, and each one carried himself with the easy confidence of a man whose body was his primary tool, and he trusted it completely. But they were not identical. The one in the middle, the one who had spoken, had a long scar running down his right forearm and an air of quiet authority. The one to the left wore a red bandana around his neck, his jaw set harder than the others, and an old scar puckered the skin of his left shoulder where it showed above his collar. His gaze was the most unsettling of the 3, sharp and restless and faintly hostile, scanning everything around him with the vigilance of a man who expected trouble and almost welcomed it. The third on the right wore a blue bandana and had the gentlest face, his mouth curved in the beginning of a smile, his hands marked with dried clay. The one in the middle stepped forward and picked up her trunk. One hand. He lifted it onto his shoulder the way she might lift a handkerchief, and she watched the muscles in his arms shift beneath sun-darkened skin as he settled the weight without any visible effort at all. His eyes looked down at her, not unkind, but assessing. "You are Eliza Thornton, the bride Kincaid sent back." Not a question, a statement. News traveled faster than stagecoaches in small towns, and Copper Bend was a very small town. Eliza felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she lifted her chin. She had been humiliated enough for one lifetime. She was not going to stand here and be small. "I am Eliza Thornton. I hold a diploma from the Boston Academy for Young Women. I can read Greek and Latin. I have studied mathematics through calculus. I have read more books than Virgil Kincaid has likely seen in his entire life. If that makes me unsuitable as a wife, then yes, I was sent back." The one with the red bandana made a sharp, dismissive sound through his nose and turned his face away. The one with the blue bandana let out a low whistle, the kind a man makes when something impresses him against his will. The one in the middle said nothing for a long moment. He just looked at her, and Eliza had the strange sensation of being weighed on a scale she could not see, measured against some internal standard she did not understand. Then he set her trunk down on the platform carefully and straightened to his full height. I am Silas Drummond. These are my brothers. Boone. He tilted his head toward the one with the red bandana. And Emmett, the one with the blue bandana, touched the brim of his hat. We have a ranch 5 miles outside of town. 300 head of cattle. Our father built it from nothing and left it to the three of us when he died. He paused, and something crossed his face that Eliza would later come to recognize as the particular anguish of a proud man forcing himself to reveal a weakness. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, as though the words cost him something to say aloud in a public place where anyone might hear. None of us can read. The platform seemed to go quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. Our father died when we were boys. There was no school within 50 miles, no money for a tutor, and too much work to be done just to survive. I picked up a few words over the years, enough to read a sign or a brand, but not enough to understand a contract or a bank document or a ledger. My brothers cannot read at all. He looked straight into her eyes, and Eliza saw something there that she recognized because she had felt it herself not 20 minutes ago. Desperation carefully controlled. The absolute refusal to beg, combined with the absolute knowledge that you needed help and could not get it alone. For 15 years, people have taken advantage of that. They have cheated us on cattle prices, written contracts we could not verify, and charged us interest we could not calculate. We have survived because we work harder than anyone in this territory and because the land is good. But surviving is not the same as thriving, and I am tired of being a man who cannot read his own name on a deed. He said all of this, standing in the middle of the depot platform, in full view of whatever passersby might be watching in a town where reputation was currency and the admission of weakness could follow a man for decades. Eliza understood with sudden clarity what it had cost him to say these words out loud. A man like Silas Drummond did not confess vulnerability easily. The fact that he was doing it now here meant he was either desperate or brave. Probably both. I have a proposition, he continued. You need a place to stay and a way to earn a living. We need someone to teach us to read and write and handle numbers. I will pay you a fair wage, provide room and board, and if the arrangement does not suit you, I will pay your passage to wherever you want to go. You would stay with our housekeeper Opal Reeves and her husband Jasper. They have been with us for over a decade. You would be safe and everything would be proper and respectable. Boone spoke, then his voice hard-edged and hostile. You have lost your mind, brother, bringing a stranger into our home, a woman. We do not need anyone's help. Emmett cut in before Silas could respond, his tone light but with an edge beneath it that surprised Eliza. Is that right, Boone? We do not need help. Last season, Polk cheated us out of $200 because none of us could read the contract he put in front of us. Before that, you signed the bank loan papers without understanding a single word on the page. How much more do we need to lose before you admit we have a problem? Boone's jaw muscles twitched visibly beneath the stubble of his beard. His hands, which were enormous and scarred across the knuckles, curled into fists at his sides. He did not answer, but the look he gave Eliza when their eyes met was unmistakable. It said clear as speech, I do not want you here. Eliza looked at the three of them, one quiet and determined, one angry and resistant, one friendly and practical. Then she looked around the depot. $4, no connections, nowhere else in the world to go. I accept, she said, but I have a condition. I teach seriously, not as a pastime. Anyone who is not willing to do the work should not waste my time. Silas nodded once. Emmett smiled wide. Boone swung himself onto his horse without a word and rode out ahead of them, and the dust his horse kicked up hung in the air like a door slamming shut. The road to the Drummond Ranch wound through a valley so wide and open it seemed to Eliza like the land itself was breathing. Golden grass rolled in waves on either side, rippling in the wind like the surface of a vast, slow ocean. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks blue and ancient, against a sky so enormous it made every sky she had ever seen in Boston look like a ceiling. She had read about the West in books. She had seen engravings and paintings, but nothing had prepared her for the scale of it, the sheer overwhelming vastness that made her feel simultaneously tiny and strangely free. Emmett drove the wagon, sitting beside her on the bench seat, pointing out landmarks with an easy familiarity that told her he loved this land in the way some people love their children. That creek runs year-round, he said, gesturing toward a line of green vegetation cutting through the gold. Never dried up, not even in the drought of 74. And up past those pines, that is where the elk come down in autumn. You can hear them bugling at dawn. Sounds like music from another world. You read the land well, Eliza observed. Emmett glanced at her, a flicker of surprise, and then something rueful in his expression. I can read the sky and the soil and the behavior of animals. I can tell you what the weather will do 3 days from now by looking at the clouds, but I cannot read a piece of paper with words on it. He paused. That is the strangest thing about my life. I understand everything around me except the one thing that is supposed to be simple. Silas rode ahead on a tall bay horse, his back straight, scanning the horizon in every direction, with the automatic vigilance of a man responsible for 300 head of cattle and several hundred acres of grassland. Boone was nowhere in sight. He had ridden ahead at a gallop and not looked back. The ranch appeared as they crested a low ridge, and Eliza felt her breath catch in her chest. It sat in the palm of the valley, backed against the mountain's western slope, and it was beautiful in the way that things built with care and purpose are always beautiful. The main house was large and solid, constructed from pine logs that had aged to a warm honey color, with a wide front porch and real glass windows that caught the evening light. A barn stood nearby, painted red and white, and beyond it cattle dotted the grassland in clusters of brown and black. A smaller house, neat and well-maintained, sat perhaps 200 feet from the main house, connected by a worn footpath through the grass. Opal Reeves came out to meet them before the wagon had fully stopped. She was somewhere around 55, with steel gray hair pulled into a tight bun, a weathered face that had been handsome in its youth and was now striking in its character, and eyes that Eliza would come to learn missed nothing. She was a white woman from Kentucky who had come west with her husband Jasper 15 years ago and stayed because the land suited her better than the bluegrass ever had. She looked at Eliza, a long, thorough, uncompromising look that took in the wrinkled dress, the road dust, the red-rimmed eyes, the determined set of her jaw. Then she nodded as though something had been confirmed. Well, it is about time. I have been telling these boys they need to learn their letters for 10 years. Stubborn as their cattle and twice as hard-headed. She took Eliza's arm with surprising warmth. Come inside, honey. You look like you have had a day. The room in the Reeves house was small but clean. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a white basin and pitcher, a window that looked out over the grassland toward the mountains, and on the small table beside the bed, a jar of wildflowers, yellow daisies and purple sage arranged with a rough tenderness that suggested they had been picked by hands more accustomed to holding tools than stems. Eliza did not know who had placed them there. She stood in the doorway looking at those flowers for a long time, and the small, unexpected kindness of it finally cracked something in her chest that she had been holding together since Copper Bend, and she sat down on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed her hands over her eyes and breathed through the burning in her throat until it passed. She did not cry, but it was close. That evening, after a supper of salt pork and beans and cornbread that Opal served with brisk efficiency, Eliza sat on the porch of the smaller house watching the last light fade from the sky. The colors were extraordinary, orange and violet, and a deep bruised red along the mountain ridges fading to indigo overhead, where the first stars were appearing sharp and close in the thin mountain air. Opal came out and sat beside her, a cup of coffee in each hand. She passed one to Eliza without asking whether she wanted it. I am going to tell you something, Opal said, because I am too old and too tired to play games, and because you need to know it before you start teaching those boys tomorrow. She took a sip of coffee, her eyes on the darkening valley. The ranch is in trouble, serious trouble. 2 years ago, Cornelius Blaine at the bank in town loaned the boys money to expand the herd. Silas was down with fever at the time. Bad fever nearly died. So Boone went to the bank in his place and signed the loan papers. She paused, letting the weight of what she was about to say settle. Boone cannot read, not a word, undone. He signed papers he did not understand, and Blaine knew it. I believe Blaine put things in that contract that no honest banker would put in front of a man who could not read them. Hidden terms. Traps. I cannot prove it because I cannot read well enough myself to parse legal language. But I know Blaine, and I know the kind of man he is. How long until the loan comes due? Eliza asked. 6 months. And if they cannot pay, Blaine takes the ranch, everything their father built, Everything those boys have worked for since they were children. Gone. Opal turned to look at Eliza directly, and in the failing light, her eyes were fierce and worried and absolutely honest. There is more. Virgil Kincaid, the man who sent you back. He and Blaine are thick as thieves. Kincaid wants the eastern parcel of Drummond land. It has the only reliable water source in the valley during drought season. He has tried to buy it from the boys 3 times, and they have refused. I believe this entire arrangement, the loan and the terms, all of it is designed to force them to sell or to lose everything. Eliza sat very still. The coffee in her cup had gone cold. Out in the valley, the last thin line of red light vanished from the mountain peaks, and the stars blazed overhead in their thousands. Silas does not want you to know this, Opal said quietly. He has too much pride. He brought you here to teach them to read, and that is all he thinks he is asking for. But I have watched those boys since they were teenagers, and I am telling you the truth. You are not just here to teach the alphabet. You are here because this ranch is 6 months from being stolen, and you are the only person who might be able to stop it. Eliza looked out into the darkness toward the main house where a single lamp burned in a window. She had come to Montana to be a bride. She had been sent back as a failure, and now she was being told that the trunk full of books that Virgil Kincaid had mocked the education he had called useless, the mind he had dismissed as too much, might be the only weapon capable of saving 3 men's inheritance. She thought about that for a long time after Opal went inside. She sat on the porch in the dark and listened to the wind moving through the grass, a sound like breathing, like the land itself was alive and restless. And she thought about her books and her numbers and her Greek and her calculus, and she thought about 3 men who could rope a steer and build a barn and read the sky for weather, but could not read the paper that might take their home away. She went to bed that night with a feeling she had not expected to feel. Not fear, not sadness, something sharper and more dangerous than either. Purpose. The first lesson took place the following morning at 7 o'clock in the main house parlor. The room was large and simply furnished a stone fireplace, along one wall, a heavy pine table in the center, and windows that let in the early light in long golden bars across the floor. Eliza arranged the supplies Silas had purchased from the general store in town, paper pencils, chalk, and a slate board, all brand new, still smelling of the store. Emmett arrived first, exactly on time, sliding into a chair at the table with an eagerness that reminded Eliza of the youngest students she had assisted at the academy, the ones who still found learning exciting rather than obligatory. His eyes were bright, and he sat up straight, his large, clay-stained hands folded neatly on the table, watching her with the attentiveness of a man who had been waiting for this moment without knowing he was waiting. Silas came a few minutes later, his expression serious, his movements deliberate. He sat down, placed both hands flat on the table, palms down, the calluses and scars visible against the smooth pine, and said simply, "I am ready." Boone did not come. Eliza began with the alphabet. She wrote each letter on the slate board in her clear teacher's hand, pronounced it, explained the sounds it made, gave examples. A as in apple or as in ache. B as in barn or book or Boone. She watched their faces as she worked, reading her students the way she had been trained to do, watching for confusion, for frustration, for the small spark of comprehension that meant a connection had been made. Emmett was startling. He repeated each sound with perfect accuracy, his ear for language natural and intuitive. And when she handed him the chalk, his hand accustomed to gripping hammers and chisels, produced letters that were rough but unmistakably correct. He grinned when he finished the first row, a wide, boyish grin that transformed his weathered face, and Eliza found herself smiling back despite everything. Silas was slower, more careful. He wrote each letter as though he were carving it into stone, pressing the chalk down with steady, deliberate pressure, refusing to move on until each line was exactly right. When he finished writing his own name for the first time, Silas, he sat looking at the paper for a very long time. The parlor was quiet except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the fields. 31 years, he said, his voice low and rough, edged with something Eliza could only call wonder. First time I have ever written my own name. Eliza felt her throat tighten. She kept her voice steady, professional, the way she had been taught. You have excellent penmanship for a beginner, Silas. Now let us continue. They worked until 9 o'clock when the demands of the ranch pulled the men away to their labor. As Silas stood, he looked at Eliza with an expression she could not quite read. Gratitude mixed with something else, something careful and guarded. "Same time tonight?" he asked. 7 to 9. "Yes, and practice in between. Copy the letters until your hand knows them without thinking. Muscle memory is as important as mental knowledge." "I will," Silas said, and the way he said it, low and certain, was not the casual promise of a man being polite. It was an oath. Boone appeared at noon after the lesson was long over. He leaned against the door frame of the parlor, arms crossed over his broad chest, and looked at the alphabet still written on the slate board with an expression of deliberate contempt. "I can break a wild horse," he said. "I can drop a deer at 300 yards. I built the barn and half the fences on this ranch with my own hands. I do not need letters on a board to do my work." Eliza looked at him. She did not flinch. She did not soften. She had faced dismissal from Virgil Kincaid, and she had faced the whispers at the depot, and she was finished being made small by men who confused their discomfort with her inadequacy. "You are right," she said calmly. "You do not need letters to break a horse. But you do need letters to keep the ranch your father built from being stolen out from under you by men who can read the contracts you cannot." The effect was immediate and devastating. Boone's face went white. Not with anger, though anger came a moment later, fast and hot. Beneath the anger was something rawer. Shame. Deep, corrosive, 2-year-old shame that Eliza had struck without meaning to, or perhaps exactly meaning to because she was a teacher, and teachers learned quickly where the wound was. Boone hit the door frame with his fist. The wood shuddered. Then he turned and walked out, his boots heavy on the porch boards, and a moment later the barn door slammed hard enough to echo off the mountainside. Emmett, who had returned to collect something from the parlor, stood quietly in the corner. He sighed. "Do not worry about him. He is angry at himself, not at you. He is the one who signed those loan papers 2 years ago. Silas was sick, and someone had to go to the bank, and Boone went because he is the second oldest, and he thought he could handle it. Blaine rushed him, told him it was standard paperwork, nothing unusual. And Boone signed because he could not read a single word on the page, and he was too proud to admit it." Emmett paused, and his gentle face was suddenly grown old. "He has not forgiven himself. I do not think he knows how." 3 days later, Eliza discovered something that changed her understanding of Boone Drummond entirely. She woke in the middle of the night thirsty and went to the small kitchen in the Reeves house for water. Through the window above the sink, she saw a faint light flickering in the barn. Her first thought was fire, and her heart seized. She pulled a shawl over her nightgown and hurried outside the grass, cold and wet with dew beneath her bare feet. She reached the barn and peered through a gap between the door planks. Boone sat on a pile of hay in the corner, a stub of candle burning beside him, a piece of chalk gripped in his enormous hand. On the wooden wall of the horse stall, he had drawn letters. Crooked, uneven, mostly wrong. He was trying to copy the alphabet from memory writing and erasing with his palm, and writing again, his face a mask of furious concentration. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out like ropes beneath his stubble. His brow was furrowed deep, and in the flickering candlelight, his expression had the desperate intensity of a man fighting a battle he was not sure he could win, but could not afford to lose. He was not a man who hated learning. He was a man who was terrified of being seen failing at it. He would rather practice alone in a barn at midnight than admit in daylight that he could not do what a child could do. Eliza backed away silently. She returned to her room and lay awake until dawn, thinking. In the morning, she left something on the workbench in the barn, a single sheet of paper written in her clearest hand. The alphabet, each letter paired with a simple drawing. A for apple with a sketch of an apple. B for bull with a sketch of a longhorn. C for creek. A for horse. For mountain. Every image drawn from the world Boone lived in, the world he understood better than anyone. She did not sign it. She did not mention it. She did not look at him differently at breakfast or speak to him at all. The paper was gone by evening, and 3 nights later, when Eliza happened to glance out the window again, in the small hours the letters on the barn wall were straighter, more certain, closer to right. She said nothing, but she left more papers on the workbench, progressing from letters to simple words. Horse, rope, water, brand, gate, saddle. Each word from his world translated into the language of ink and paper. Each morning the papers were gone. Each night the barn wall showed improvement. It was their secret. A conversation conducted entirely in chalk and paper between two stubborn people who understood each other better than either would admit. 2 weeks after Eliza's arrival, the sound of hooves brought everyone to the porch. Virgil Kincaid rode into the Drummond ranch yard flanked by two of his ranch hands, mounted men with hard faces and sidearms visible on their hips. Kincaid himself was dressed finer than any working rancher had reason to dress, with a pressed shirt and polished boots and a mustache trimmed with the precision of a man who spent time in front of mirrors. He dismounted with the ease of a man who expected the ground to welcome him wherever he went. He had not come for Eliza. He had come for the land. "I am here with a friendly offer," Kincaid said, standing at the base of the porch steps looking up at Silas with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "The eastern parcel, good waterland. I have asked before and you have said no. But circumstances change. I understand you owe Cornelius Blaine a considerable sum, and the payment date is approaching. Sell me the eastern parcel at a fair price, and I will personally ensure that Blaine gives you an extension." He let the implication hang in the air. A generous offer from a reasonable man. Unless you understood what was really being said, which was, "I control the banker who controls your debt, and I am offering you the chance to surrender a piece of your land voluntarily before I take all of it." Then Kincaid's eyes found the window where Eliza stood watching, and his expression shifted to something between amusement and disdain. "Well now, Miss Thornton, I see you have found yourself a place to land after all." His voice carried easily across the yard pitched for an audience. "I hope you are proving more useful here than you were to me, though I confess I cannot imagine what use a fat schoolteacher might be on a cattle ranch." The porch boards creaked as Silas stepped forward. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He simply moved to the edge of the porch and stood there, and the sheer physical fact of him, the height, the breadth of shoulder, the absolute stillness of a man who did not need to posture because his presence was threat enough, changed the entire geometry of the conversation. "You will not insult anyone under my roof again," Silas said. His voice was low, almost quiet. "Not today, not ever." Boone appeared on his left arm's folded jaw set, radiating hostility. Emmett took the right, his gentle face gone hard. 3 brothers, 3 walls. The Drummond men stood shoulder to shoulder on that porch, a barrier that no reasonable person would attempt to breach. And the message was not about romance or gallantry. It was about principle. You are on our land. She is under our protection. That is all you need to know. Kincaid looked at the 3 of them. He was a calculating man, and the calculation was clear on his face. He was not afraid, not exactly, but he was practical. He put his foot in the stirrup and swung up into his saddle. 6 months, Drummond, he said, and the friendliness was gone from his voice now, replaced by something flat and patient and cold. Think it over. He rode out the way he had come, his 2 men trailing behind, and the dust they raised settled slowly over the empty yard. That evening, Eliza asked Silas for the loan documents. He hesitated. She could see the resistance in him, the deep unwillingness to hand over financial papers to someone outside the family, to a woman to reveal the full extent of his vulnerability. His jaw worked silently. His hands opened and closed at his sides. Emmett, standing by the fireplace, spoke quietly. "Brother, we cannot read them. She can. Which matters more, our pride or our land?" Silas opened the desk drawer and pulled out a sheaf of papers, creased and coffee-stained, and placed them on the table in front of Eliza. She read them carefully, page by page, her face growing paler with each clause. When she finished, the parlor was silent. Silas, Emmett, and Boone stood around the table watching her, 3 large men waiting for a verdict from a woman half their size. "The interest rate written in this contract is 14%, Eliza said, keeping her voice even. "Blaine told you 6% verbally, is that correct?" Silas nodded slowly. "There is a penalty clause. If you are late on any payment by even 1 day, the interest doubles. And there is a provision buried in the language of Section 4 that allows Blaine to seize the ranch if you fail to comply with any reasonable request from the lender. The word reasonable is not defined anywhere in the document. It could mean anything he wants it to mean." She laid the papers down flat on the table. "You were deceived. This contract is a trap. And I believe it was designed that way deliberately because Blaine knew you could not read it, and he knew Kincaid wanted your land." The silence that followed was the loudest silence Eliza had ever heard. Silas sat down heavily, his face unreadable, carved from the same stone as the mountains outside. Emmett looked at his hands. Boone stood up so fast his chair toppled backward, and he kicked it aside and walked straight out the door, his boots slamming against the porch boards, and the sound echoed across the valley until it faded into the dark. Opal Reeves appeared in the doorway, her face grave. She looked at the papers on the table, looked at Eliza, and said what she had been wanting to say since the day Eliza arrived. Now you see it. Now you understand. It is not just reading lessons. You have to save this ranch. Eliza looked at the contract. She looked at the door where Boone had vanished. She looked at Silas sitting motionless at the table, a strong, proud man confronting the possibility that everything his father had built and everything he had spent his life protecting might be taken from him because he had never learned to read. She had arrived in Montana as a bride no one wanted, a woman too educated, too opinionated, too heavy, too much. She had been returned like defective goods, her greatest qualities declared her worst flaws. But sitting at that pine table in the lamplight, surrounded by books she had carried 1,000 miles, in a trunk too heavy to lift alone, Isa Thornton understood something with sudden and absolute clarity. Everything she was, everything Virgil Kincaid had despised was exactly what was needed here. Her mathematics, her ability to read complex documents, her education in logic and law, and the precise, unforgiving language of contracts. The weapons she carried were not guns or ropes. They were words and numbers and the trained mind to use them. Kincaid had called her useless. He was about to discover how wrong he was. The work began the next morning before dawn. Eliza sat at the pine table in the parlor with the loan documents spread before her, a fresh sheet of paper beside them, and a pencil sharpened to a fine point. She had not slept well. The numbers from the contract had followed her into the dark hours, arranging and rearranging themselves behind her closed eyes, and by the time the first gray light appeared at the window, she had already identified the structure of the trap that Cornelius Blaine had built around the Drummond brothers. It was elegant in a terrible way. The stated interest rate of 14% was high, but not quite illegal under Montana territorial law. The penalty clause for late payment was brutal but technically enforceable. The provision allowing seizure for failure to comply with any reasonable request was the masterpiece, the clause that turned the entire contract into a loaded weapon pointed at the Drummond Ranch. Blaine could demand anything. Demand they sell a portion of the herd at below market price. Demand they grant access to the eastern water source. Demand they accept new terms. And if they refused, he could call the refusal unreasonable and begin seizure proceedings. But there were cracks in the structure. Eliza found them the way she had been trained to find errors in mathematical proofs by examining every assumption, every logical step, every place where the argument depended on something that might not hold. The first crack, the interest rate on the signed document did not match the rate Blaine had quoted verbally. If witnesses could confirm that Blaine had told the brothers 6% while the contract read 14, that was evidence of deliberate misrepresentation. The second crack, Boone had signed the contract. Boone could not read. If it could be demonstrated that Blaine knew the signer was illiterate and took advantage of that fact, the contract could be challenged as unconscionable under common law principles that Eliza had studied in her commercial law course at the academy. The third crack, and the most important, the contract's vague language about reasonable request had no legal precedent supporting it in Montana territory. It was a bully's clause designed to intimidate, but it had never been tested before a judge. A competent lawyer might tear it apart. Eliza spent 3 days building her case. She created a ledger comparing the payments the brothers had actually made against what they should have owed at the stated verbal rate of 6%. The difference was staggering. Over 2 years, the Drummond brothers had overpaid by more than $400, a sum that represented months of labor, dozens of cattle, the margin between stability and ruin. On the third evening, she asked all three brothers to sit down at the parlor table. Silas came immediately. Emmett followed. Boone leaned against the far wall with his arms crossed, close enough to listen, but positioned to suggest he was there by coincidence rather than interest. Eliza laid out her findings. She did not soften the language or cushion the blow. These were men who worked with their hands in weather that could kill the unprepared. They did not need gentleness. They needed truth. "You have been paying nearly 2.5 times what you should owe in interest," she said, pointing to the columns of figures on her ledger. $412 overpaid in 24 months. That money did not disappear. It went into Blaine's pocket. She turned to a second sheet of paper, this one covered with a diagram she had drawn connecting three names with lines and arrows. But it is not just the bank. The cattle broker you have been selling through a man named Polk has been buying your livestock at 30 to 40% below market value and reselling at full price. Polk works for Kincaid. I confirmed this by checking the brand registry at the territorial office when I went to town for supplies. Polk's operation is registered at Kincaid's ranch address. She drew her finger along the connecting lines. Kincaid, Blaine, and Polk. Three men working together from three directions. The bank squeezes you with inflated interest. The broker suppresses your income by underpaying for your cattle. And Kincaid waits patient as a vulture for the moment when the financial pressure becomes unbearable and you are forced to sell the eastern parcel or lose everything. She looked up from the diagram and met their eyes one brother at a time. They built this trap because they knew you could not read. Every piece of it depends on your inability to check the numbers, verify the contracts, or understand the documents you signed. That is their weapon, your illiteracy, and they have been using it against you for years. The silence in the parlor was absolute. The clock on the mantel ticked. A horse stamped in the barn outside. Wind pressed against the windows. Silas spoke first, his voice dangerously quiet. My father built this ranch from bare ground. He came here with nothing but an ass and a mule, and he cleared the land and dug the well and raised the house beam by beam. He died in this parlor in the chair I am sitting in right now, and his last words to me were, take care of your brothers and hold this land. He looked at the diagram with the three names connected by lines. His jaw was set so tight the muscles at his temples stood out beneath the skin. I will not lose it. I swore on his grave, and I meant it. Emmett nodded slowly, his gentle face grave. Boone said nothing. He had uncrossed his arms during Eliza's presentation, and his hands now hung at his sides, opening and closing in slow fists, and the expression on his face was not anger. It was something worse than anger. It was the sick recognition of a man seeing the full scope of a mistake he made 2 years ago when he sat in a banker's office and put his name on a piece of paper he could not read. Eliza presented her plan. 2 prongs, simultaneous, both essential. First, we fix the money. Cut out Polk entirely. You will sell your cattle directly at the market in Fort Ellis. The prices are posted publicly. Silas, you are progressing fast enough that within a few weeks, you should be able to read basic sales contracts. In the meantime, I will accompany you to verify the terms. We also diversify revenue. Hides, tallow, and horn can be sold separately to the tannery and chandler. I have calculated the potential additional income. She showed them the figures. If we execute this correctly, your monthly revenue increases by approximately 40%. Second, we build the legal case. I have drafted a letter to a lawyer in Helena named Thaddeus Burke. He specializes in commercial disputes and has a reputation for integrity. I need your permission to send it along with copies of the loan documents and my analysis. If Burke agrees to take the case, we will need money to retain him. That money comes from the increased revenue. She paused, looking at each of them again. This is not quick. This is not easy. It requires all three of you to keep learning, to keep working, and to trust the process even when it feels slow. But the alternative is losing this ranch in 6 months, and I will not let that happen if there is anything in my power to prevent it. Silas looked at her for a long time. Then he said, you talk like you plan to stay until this is finished. I accepted a position, Eliza replied. I finish what I start. Something shifted in Silas's expression, a warmth that had nothing to do with the lamplight and everything to do with the woman sitting across from him, small and round-faced and utterly certain. Her chin set in that posture of defiance that he was beginning to understand was simply the way she stood in the world. The first month of the new plan produced results that even Eliza had not anticipated. Without Polk as middleman, the Drummond cattle sold at full market price at Fort Ellis. Silas rode to the first sale with Eliza beside him on the wagon, and when the buyer presented the bill of sale, Silas read it himself. Slowly, carefully, moving his finger beneath each word, his lips forming the sound silently the way Eliza had taught him. When he reached the price and confirmed it matched what had been agreed verbally, He looked at Eliza with an expression of such fierce, quiet triumph that she had to look away before her emotions showed on her face. The revenue numbers were even better than projected. 40% increase in the first month, 47 in the second. The brothers had been hemorrhaging money through Polk for years without knowing it, and the wound was now closed. Emmett took to the bookkeeping with natural aptitude, his precise carpenter's mind well suited to the orderly columns of a ledger. He recorded every transaction in the system Eliza designed, and at the end of each week, he and Eliza reviewed the numbers together, checking for errors, looking for patterns, identifying opportunities to improve efficiency. He began keeping a separate journal as well, not of numbers but of words, writing down observations about ranch life, about the animals and the weather, and the way the light changed on the mountains through the seasons. His handwriting was large and square and confident, like the man himself. "I remember things better when I sing them," Emmett confessed one evening when Eliza caught him humming the multiplication tables to the tune of a hymn he knew. He looked embarrassed, but Eliza shook her head firmly. "That is not something to be ashamed of. That is how your mind works, and it works beautifully. There are scholars at Harvard who would envy your memory for melody." Emmett grinned, and after that he sang openly, turning grammar rules into ballads and arithmetic into work songs that he hummed while mending fences and shoeing horses, and the ranch filled with the sound of a man learning to read set to music. Silas progressed with relentless discipline. He practiced every spare moment, copying words by lamplight, before bed sounding out headlines from the newspaper during breakfast, carrying a small slate in his vest pocket so he could work on his letters during the brief pauses in a rancher's endless day. His mind was analytical and penetrating. He did not simply memorize. He questioned. He probed. He wanted to understand why words were spelled the way they were, why grammar followed certain rules, why numbers behaved according to patterns that could be predicted and verified. He asked the kind of questions that Eliza's professors at the academy had asked, the questions that separated students who absorbed information from students who understood it. Within 6 weeks, Silas could read a newspaper article from beginning to end. Within 8, he was reading the loan documents himself, his finger tracking each clause, his face darkening as he truly comprehended for the first time what Blaine had done. "The bank has been overcharging us," he said one afternoon, working through the payment calculations Eliza had taught him. "I knew because you told me, but now I can see it myself, in the numbers, right there on the page." He looked up. 3 years of my life I paid too much because I could not check their arithmetic." "Now you can," Eliza said, "and you will never be cheated by numbers again." Boone's journey was different, and it began with a disaster. 3 weeks after Eliza's arrival, Boone rode to town alone to buy veterinary medicine for a sick cow. The general store clerk handed him 2 bottles, one to be administered orally and one to be applied to the skin. The labels were clearly printed in plain English. One read for internal use, the other read external use only. 2 simple phrases that any literate person could distinguish at a glance. Boone could not distinguish them. He looked at the bottles, at the black letters on the white labels, and the words were as meaningless to him as if they had been written in Chinese. He made his best guess, chose wrong, and poured the external medicine down the cow's throat. The cow was one of their best breeding stock, heavy with calf. Within minutes, she was convulsing her legs, rigid foam at her mouth. Emmett found her in time. He mixed salt water and forced it down her throat until she vomited, saving her life. But the calf was lost. Born dead an hour later, a small, still form on the straw that represented not just a life, but money the ranch desperately needed. Boone stood in the stall looking down at the dead calf. His face was the color of old ash. His massive hands hung at his sides, useless, the same hands that could gentle a wild horse and build a barn wall straight and true. The bottle was still in his coat pocket. He pulled it out and held it up, staring at the label with an expression that Eliza, watching from the barn door, would never forget. It was the face of a man confronting the full cost of the one thing he could not do. "The label," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was right there, written plain as day, and I could not read it." Eliza stepped into the stall. She did not offer comfort. She did not say it was not his fault. She said the only thing that a teacher who understood her student could say. "Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock, sit down at the table with your brothers. I will teach you to read that label." Boone looked at her. The pride that had kept him out of the parlor for weeks, the wall of stubbornness that he had maintained against her and against his own need, all of it crumbled in a barn that smelled of straw and medicine and death. He nodded once, a single sharp movement, like a man accepting a sentence. The next morning, Boone sat down at the table. Neither Silas nor Emmett commented. Silas pushed a pencil toward his brother without a word. Eliza began the lesson as though Boone had always been there. But Boone did not learn the way his brothers learned. Where Silas was methodical and Emmett was intuitive, Boone was combative. He fought each letter as though it were an opponent to be defeated. He gripped the pencil so hard that he snapped 3 of them in the first week, the wood splintering in his massive fist. And each time it happened, his face flushed dark with frustration and shame. He wanted to learn. Eliza could see that clearly now. But his anger at his own ignorance was so intense that it sabotaged his concentration, building a wall of self-recrimination that his mind could not climb over. Eliza changed her approach. She stopped teaching Boone the alphabet in the abstract and began teaching him words he needed. Real words, practical words. She wrote the names of cattle breeds on cards and placed them around the barn. She labeled every tool in the workshop, every gate in the corral, every bin in the feed storage. She copied the labels from the veterinary supplies, the ones that mattered most, and drilled Boone on them until he could read them in his sleep. The morning he read "external use only" off the bottle that had cost him, the calf his hands shook. He stood in the barn holding the bottle, staring at the 3 words, and his throat worked visibly as he swallowed against whatever was rising inside him. "That is what I needed to read that day," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "And now you can read it," Eliza said, "and you will never forget it." He looked at her. For the first time since she had arrived at the Drummond Ranch, Boone Drummond looked at Eliza Thornton without hostility, without resentment, without the defensive wall of pride that he had maintained like a fortress. What she saw in his gaze instead was raw and unguarded. Gratitude so deep it had no words, which was perhaps the most honest expression a man who was just learning language could give. After that, Boone's progress accelerated. He would never be a scholar, and he did not want to be. But he learned to read every label and sign and brand that his work required. He learned to read contracts well enough to identify the key terms. And he learned slowly and with great effort to write his name in full instead of making a mark. Boone Drummond. The letters were large and rough, and unmistakably his like tracks left in fresh earth by a man who walked heavy and walked sure. While the brothers learned, Eliza built a legal case. She wrote to Thaddeus Burke and Helena a detailed letter running to 8 pages outlining the loan terms, the discrepancy between stated and actual interest rates, the relationship between Blaine Kincaid and Polk, and the fact that the contract had been signed by an illiterate man who had been deliberately misled. She enclosed copies of every relevant document and her own mathematical analysis of the overpayments. Burke wrote back within 2 weeks. His letter was brief and professional, but Eliza could read the anger beneath the measured language. He had seen cases like this before. Predatory lending to illiterate frontier families was common enough to be systematic. And it was, in Burke's words, the most cowardly form of theft because it stole from people who did not even know they were being robbed. He agreed to take the case. His fee was $50 payable in installments, plus travel costs to Copper Bend for the hearing. The increased revenue from direct cattle sales would cover it. But Eliza also did something that went beyond the Drummond case. She began visiting other families in the valley, ranchers and homesteaders who she suspected might have similar contracts with Blaine. She rode out with Silas or Emmett on weekends, bringing her books and her pencils, and she sat in kitchens and parlors and barn lofts reading loan documents for families who had never been able to read them for themselves. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions. Blaine had been running the same scheme across the valley. Inflated interest rates, hidden penalty clauses, vague provisions that gave the bank unlimited power. At least 5 other families were trapped in contracts they did not understand, paying money they did not owe, slowly being squeezed toward bankruptcy. "It is not just you," Eliza told the brothers when she returned from her visits. "He is doing this to everyone who cannot read. The Tanners, the Whitfields, old Mrs. Grady, the Patterson family with 5 children. All of them paying too much, all of them one bad season away from losing everything." Silas absorbed this information with the quiet intensity that Eliza had come to recognize as his way of processing something important. He did not react immediately. He turned it over in his mind, examining it from every angle, and when he finally spoke, his words had the weight of something that had been carefully constructed. Then this is not just about our ranch, this is about the whole valley. Yes, Eliza said, and that makes the case stronger. One family challenging a bank can be dismissed. Six families challenging the same bank with the same evidence becomes a pattern that no judge can ignore. It was Emmett who saw the strategic implication first. We need those other families to trust us enough to join the case, to hand over their documents, to stand up in front of a judge and admit they were fooled. Yes, Eliza said again. Then they need to see that we have changed, Emmett said slowly, that we are not the same men who got cheated. They need to see us reading, calculating, managing our ranch like men who know what they are doing. Otherwise, why would they follow us into a fight? Silas nodded, and Eliza saw in that moment the leader he truly was, not because he gave orders or raised his voice, but because he understood that leadership was about proving something through action before asking others to take a risk. We will show them, Silas said. We will hold a public cattle sale at the ranch. Invite the whole community. Let them see what this ranch looks like when it is run by men who can read their own books. Virgil Kincaid struck before the sale could happen. Not in person. His weapon was subtler and in many ways more dangerous than any direct confrontation. The rumors began appearing in Copper Bend like weeds after rain. A woman alone with three unmarried men. A bride too fat for one husband, so she moved in with three. The whispers slithered through the general store, and the church pews and the saloon growing more elaborate and more vicious with each retelling, and Kincaid's hand in their creation was invisible, but unmistakable to anyone who understood how a man like him operated. Eliza discovered the rumors when she went to town for supplies. The woman at the dry goods counter, who had been perfectly friendly the week before, would not meet her eyes. A group of women outside the church stopped talking when she approached and did not resume until she had passed. And then their voices dropped to that particular frequency that human beings use when they want you to know they are talking about you without giving you the satisfaction of hearing the words. At the feed store, the clerk told her they were out of the grain she needed. When she looked past him to the full shelves behind the counter, he simply shrugged and said he could not help her. She rode back to the ranch with the supplies she had managed to purchase and went directly to her room in the Reeves house and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time staring at the wildflowers on the table, which Opal replaced fresh every few days, and she pressed her palms flat against her knees to stop them from shaking. She had been called too fat, too educated, too opinionated. She had been sent back like defective merchandise. She had survived all of that. But this was different. This was not one man rejecting her. This was an entire community being poisoned against her, and the cruelty of it was that the poison worked by turning her greatest vulnerability, her unconventional living situation, into confirmation of every ugly thing that people were willing to believe about a woman who did not fit the expected shape. Opal found her on the porch that evening, with red-rimmed eyes and a jaw set against trembling. The older woman did not ask questions. She sat beside Eliza and handed her a cup of coffee and waited the way women on the frontier had always waited, patient and steady, for the storm to pass or for the strength to face it to arrive. When Eliza told her what had happened in town, Opal nodded as though she had expected it. Kincaid, he cannot beat you with contracts anymore, so he is trying to beat you with gossip. It is the weapon of a coward, but cowards can still do damage. That night, Opal told the brothers. Their reactions were immediate and characteristic. Boone wanted to ride into town. His version of a solution involved finding whoever was spreading the rumors and communicating his displeasure in a language that did not require literacy. His face was dark with fury, and he was already reaching for his hat when Emmett caught his arm. "And what will that accomplish?" Emmett asked. "You beat a man in the street, and tomorrow the rumor is not that Eliza is improper, but that the Drummond brothers are violent. Kincaid wins either way." Boone shook off his brother's hand, but did not move toward the door. Silas stood by the fireplace, his back to the room, one hand resting on the mantel. He had been silent since Opal finished speaking, and the silence had the quality of something being forged. When he turned around, his face was calm with the particular composure of a man who had considered every option and chosen the most difficult one. "We do not fight them. We do not beg them. We do not explain ourselves. We show them." He looked at Eliza. "The cattle sale. We hold it at the ranch. We invite everyone, not just buyers, the whole town. Let them come and see with their own eyes what this ranch is. Let them see Opal and Jasper, who have lived here a decade and can speak to the propriety of the arrangement. Let them see you teaching us not as some scandal, but as the most practical and respectable thing in the world. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, and in it, Eliza heard something she had not heard before, a ferocity that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with the courage that operates through patience. And when Blaine shows up, because he will show up, we will be ready. The cattle sale drew nearly the entire population of Copper Bend and the surrounding valley. They came in wagons and on horseback, and a few on foot, drawn partly by the Drummond reputation for quality livestock, and partly by naked curiosity about the arrangement that had provided so much fuel for speculation. They expected to find something salacious, something that confirmed the whispers. What they found was a ranch in immaculate order. Fences mended, barn freshly whitewashed, cattle groomed and sorted by grade. Opal Reeves presided over a table of refreshments, with the dignity of a woman who had nothing to hide and nothing to apologize for, and her husband Jasper stood beside her, his weathered face radiating the quiet authority of a man whose word had never been questioned in 15 years of community life. Eliza sat at a desk near the corral with the sale ledger open before her, recording each transaction in neat columns, calculating prices and totals, with the swift confidence of a woman for whom numbers were as natural as breathing. Her presence was professional and unambiguous. She was working, clearly, competently, and without the slightest trace of impropriety. But the moment that changed everything came from Silas. He stood before the assembled crowd, a sheet of paper in his hand, and he read aloud the terms and conditions of the sale. His voice was steady, clear, and unhesitating. Each word pronounced correctly, each sentence delivered with quiet authority, because he understood what he was saying, because he had learned to read it himself. The crowd went silent. Not a polite silence, but a stunned one. Every person in Copper Bend knew that Silas Drummond could not read, had never been able to read. The Drummond brothers' illiteracy was one of those things that everyone knew and no one mentioned. It was simply a fact of life in the valley. And now Silas Drummond was standing in front of them, reading a legal document without stumbling over a single word. Emmett handled the livestock presentations, explaining its breeds and lineage and health records with a fluency that revealed not just memorized facts but genuine understanding. Boone worked the cattle themselves, moving through the herd on horseback, with the fluid precision of a man who had been doing this work since boyhood, cutting and sorting animals with a skill that no amount of book learning could replicate. Then Cornelius Blaine arrived. He came in a buggy, dressed in a dark suit, his thin face arranged in an expression of benevolent authority. He was a tall, narrow man with the careful posture of someone who believed his own respectability and expected others to believe it too. He approached Silas with a document in his hand, a single page. He held it out with a smile that showed his teeth, but not his eyes. "Silas, good day. Fine event you have here. I have some routine paperwork. An addendum to your existing loan, standard terms adjustment. Nothing unusual. If you could just sign here." He produced a pen and indicated a line at the bottom of the page. It was a move he had made before, many times with many people. Present a document in a public setting where the pressure of watching eyes made refusal feel like an admission of ignorance or bad faith. Smile. Call it routine. Expect the illiterate man to sign because he always had before. Eliza was already moving. She stepped forward from the desk, her hand extended, and took the paper from Blaine before Silas could reach for the pen. Blaine's expression flickered with surprise and then irritation. Eliza read the document, not silently, aloud, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet crowd, each word enunciated with the precision of a woman who had taught elocution to academy students and knew exactly how to project. She read every line, and then she stopped and looked at Blaine with an expression that could have frozen the creek in midsummer. "This addendum," she said, her voice calm and carrying, "authorizes an increase in the interest rate from 14% to 20% and shortens the repayment period from 6 months to 3. If signed, it would make the remaining loan balance due in 90 days instead of 180. It would guarantee default and give you grounds to seize the ranch." She paused. The crowd was absolutely silent. Somewhere a horse stamped and snorted. A child whimpered and was hushed. "Mr. Blaine, You are attempting to trick these men into signing away their property in front of their neighbors and friends. You brought this document here today because you expected that no one would read it, that no one could read it. She folded the paper once crisply and held it at her side. You were wrong. Blaine's face had gone the color of old ash. He opened his mouth and what came out was an attempt at recovery, smooth and practiced. Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you this is a simple misunderstanding. The terms are standard, and I would not expect a woman unfamiliar with banking to properly interpret. He did not finish the sentence. Boone stepped forward. The largest of the three brothers, the one whose temper and physical presence made most men step back instinctively. He took the folded paper from Eliza's hand, and he read it, slowly, word by word. His voice was rough and unpracticed, halting on the longer words but unmistakably accurate. He read the clause about the interest rate increase. He read the clause about the shortened repayment. He read the seizure provision. And when he finished, he looked up from the paper and fixed Blaine with the full force of his gaze. I can read it now, Boone said. The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Before I could not. When you put that loan contract in front of me 2 years ago, you knew I could not read it. You watched me hold the pen wrong. You watched me sign my name like a child. And you smiled and shook my hand and told me everything was standard. Everything was normal. His voice did not rise. That was the most frightening thing about it. Boone Drummond, who everyone in the valley knew as a man of volcanic temper, spoke with a control that was more devastating than any shout. I trusted you because you were the bank. I was taught to trust the bank. And you used that trust to steal from my family. The murmur that went through the crowd was like the sound of wind moving through timber before a storm. Heads turned, people looked at each other, and Eliza could see it happening, the slow, terrible recognition spreading from face to face as people in the crowd who also banked with Blaine, who also could not read, who also had signed papers they did not understand, began to wonder what was written in their own contracts. An old rancher named Roscoe Tanner, white-haired and stooped, but with eyes sharp as a hawk's, stepped forward from the crowd. I want someone to read my contract, too, he said. His voice was quiet, but in the silence it carried like a gunshot. Then another voice, then another. Within minutes, half a dozen people were speaking in at once, and Blaine stood in the middle of it all with his careful mask crumbling, and Kincaid, who had not attended the sale, but whose presence was felt in every whisper and scheme that had led to this moment, was nowhere to be seen. The cattle sale ended, the crowd dispersed, but something had changed in the valley that day, something that could not be unchanged. The Drummond brothers were no longer the illiterate ranchers that people quietly pitied or casually cheated. They were men who had transformed themselves, and the woman who had helped them do it was no longer the scandal that gossip had made her. She was something else entirely. Autumn came to the valley with cold, clear nights, and the first frost painting the grass silver at dawn. The cottonwood trees along the creek turned gold, then amber, then bare, and the mountains put on their first cap of white snow, a warning and a promise of the winter ahead. The lessons continued every morning and every evening, but they had evolved. Silas was reading books now, real books, and he had developed a particular hunger for history that surprised and delighted Eliza. He devoured accounts of ancient Rome and the American Revolution with equal intensity, asking questions that connected distant events to present realities with a sophistication that would have impressed any university professor. These senators in Rome, he said one evening, tapping a page about the fall of the Republic, they used law to steal land from farmers who could not defend themselves in court. That is exactly what Blaine is doing. Same crime, different century. Eliza looked at him across the table, lamplight warm on his face, and felt something shift in her chest that she had been trying very hard to ignore. She had been trying for weeks now, trying not to notice the way Silas always made sure there was water on the table when she taught, trying not to notice that he walked on the outside of the road when they went to town together, positioning himself between her and the traffic of horses and wagons. Trying not to notice that he had asked Opal quietly whether Eliza was eating enough, sleeping enough, whether she needed anything that he could provide. These were not grand gestures. They were small, consistent acts of consideration, so steady and so unself-conscious that they could not possibly be calculated. They were simply what Silas did, the way he was. She tried not to notice the way his expression softened at the corners when he solved a difficult problem she had set for him, or the sound of his voice when he read aloud in the evening, low and careful. Each word weighted with the significance of a man who had waited 31 years to speak in this language. She tried not to notice that he had placed a cushioned chair on the porch at the spot where she liked to sit during lessons, and that he had never mentioned it, as though comfortable furniture simply appeared by natural processes like wildflowers or rain. She tried. She failed. One evening, teaching Silas a passage of Longfellow on the front porch in the amber light of late autumn, her voice faltered on a line about love that goes unspoken, and when she looked up, Silas was watching her with an expression that stopped her breath. "You read beautifully," he said quietly. "Your voice when you read. It sounds like water over stones. I do not know the right words to say it better than that." Eliza swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. "That is a very good way to say it," she managed. They looked at each other across the small table with the books and the slate and the pencils between them, and the autumn wind moved through the grass, and neither of them spoke for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then Eliza looked down at her book and continued the lesson, because she was his teacher and he was her student, and there were contracts to fight and a ranch to save and 100 reasons why the warmth spreading through her chest was inconvenient and impractical and could not be acted upon. Not now, not yet. But the warmth did not go away. It only grew. Opal noticed, because Opal noticed everything. "The way that boy looks at you," she told Eliza one afternoon while they hung laundry in the yard. "Last time I saw anything like it was never. He has never looked at anyone that way in all the years I have known him." 3 weeks after the cattle sale on a night without moon, Eliza was awakened by a sound she could not identify. A low, rhythmic noise coming from somewhere outside, wrong for the hour, wrong for the season. She went to the window. Shapes were moving in the far pasture, darker shadows against the dark land, and she realized with a jolt of ice in her stomach that those shapes were cattle being driven not by the Drummond brothers, but by someone who should not be there. She woke Jasper. Jasper woke the brothers. Silas was dressed and on his horse within minutes, his face blank with controlled fury. Boone followed, and Emmett, and together the three of them rode out into the darkness, while Eliza stood on the porch with Opal and Jasper, watching the shapes disappear into the black and listening to the drumming of hooves fade into the vast Montana night. They returned before dawn with 2 men roped and tied across their saddles, and 30 head of cattle recovered from the gully at Black Ridge where the thieves had been driving them. The 2 men were ranch hands. Kincaid's ranch hands. Eliza recognized them from the day Kincaid had ridden into the Drummond yard with his threats and his smile. Silas dropped a folded piece of paper on the kitchen table. It had been found in the coat pocket of one of the captured men. "I cannot read this in the dark," he said, his voice tight. "The handwriting is too cramped." Eliza unfolded the paper and held it close to the lamp. The handwriting was cramped but legible, and the message was clear and devastating. "It is from Kincaid," she said, "written in his own hand. He instructs them to move at least 30 head across Black Ridge before dawn. He offers $5 per head upon delivery." She looked up from the letter. The 3 brothers stood around the table, still breathing hard from the ride, sweat and dust on their faces in the lamplight through sharp shadows across the kitchen. "This is evidence," Eliza said, "not just of cattle theft, of Virgil Kincaid personally ordering the destruction of your livelihood. Handwritten, dated, signed with his initial." Silas took the letter and looked at it. He could not read the cramped handwriting in the dim light, but he could read the signature at the bottom, the flowing VK that Kincaid had not bothered to disguise, because he never imagined anyone on this ranch would be able to read it. "If we had caught those men 6 months ago," Silas said slowly, "before you came, we would have caught the thieves, but we would not have known Kincaid was behind it. We would not have been able to read this letter. He would have denied everything, and his men would have taken the blame alone." "Yes," Eliza said. Boone spoke from the corner of the kitchen, his voice low and rough. "Teach me to read handwriting, not just print. I want to be able to read anything any man puts on paper, whether he wants me to or not." The evidence changed everything. But before the legal case could proceed, the land itself intervened with a reminder that nature did not care about contracts or education or the schemes of dishonest men. The storm came in mid-October, a screaming fury of wind and rain and hail that turned the sky black at noon and shook the ranch house to its foundation. Lightning split the darkness in jagged white lines, striking close enough to fill the air with the sharp smell of ozone. The brothers went out to protect the herd, riding into the chaos because that was what ranchers did, because 300 head of cattle in an open pasture during a storm of this magnitude meant potential disaster. Eliza stood at the window of the Reeves house watching the storm, and for the first time since arriving at the Drummond Ranch, she felt real fear. Not the manageable anxiety of courtrooms and contracts, but the primal terror of watching someone you cared about ride into danger you could not calculate or control. Silas and Emmett returned near dawn, soaked to the bone, exhausted, their horses lathered and trembling. Boone was not with them. His horse spooked, Silas said. His face was gray with fatigue and something worse. Lightning struck close. The horse threw him near the East Creek. We could not find him in the dark. Eliza did not wait. She went to the barn. She saddled a horse, a skill she had learned in the 3 months since arriving, her hands clumsy but competent on the buckles and straps. When she led the horse out into the rain, Opal called after her from the porch, but Eliza did not stop. They found him together, the three of them riding through the gray, violent dawn. Boone lay beneath a fallen cottonwood, his left leg pinned under a heavy branch, unconscious, rain streaming over his face. The creek beside him was rising fast, brown water, surging over rocks that had been dry the day before. Silas and Emmett dismounted and set their shoulders against the branch. Eliza, the smallest, crawled beneath a tangle of broken wood to reach Boone's trapped leg. Her hands were scraped raw by bark. Her dress tore on a jagged splinter. Mud soaked through to her skin, cold and gritty. She found the angle of his leg, felt for the break, located the point where the branch was pressing hardest, and she braced herself and pulled while the brothers lifted and the branch shifted just enough, just barely enough, for her to drag him free. Boone regained consciousness on the ride back to the ranch, draped across Emmett's horse, his broken leg splinted with strips torn from a saddle blanket and a straight branch that Silas had cut with his knife. The first thing he saw when he opened his eyes was Eliza riding beside him, soaked and muddy and bleeding from a dozen small cuts, her hair plastered to her face, her jaw set with concentration. "You should not have come out in the storm," he said. His voice was weak, but the stubbornness in it was pure Boone Drummond. "Neither should you," Eliza replied. He looked at her for a long moment through the rain. Then he reached out and gripped her hand, his rough palm closing around her smaller fingers, and held it for exactly 3 seconds before letting go. "I was wrong about you," he said, "from the beginning. I was wrong. Thank you." 2 words. But from Boone Drummond, who had spent his entire adult life building walls around his pride, they weighed more than all the books in Eliza's trunk. As Boone healed, confined to bed with his splinted leg, something unexpected happened. He read. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to do but lie still, and Eliza brought him books. Not literature or philosophy. Books about horses, about breeds and bloodlines, and the science of animal behavior. Boone devoured them with the same fierce intensity he brought to everything, and what emerged from those weeks of enforced stillness was a man who suddenly understood that his lifetime of instinctive knowledge about horses had a name and a theory behind it, that what he knew in his bones was confirmed and expanded by what was written on the page. "I have been doing this my whole life without knowing why it worked," he told Eliza, tapping a passage about equine psychology. "This book puts words on things I always felt but could not explain. It is like finding out you have been speaking a language all along, but never knew its name." November brought the first snow and a letter from Thaddeus Burke confirming that the hearing had been scheduled for January before Judge McAllister, the territorial justice of the peace. Burke's letter outlined the strategy. They would argue that the loan contract was unconscionable, entered into by a party known to be illiterate, with terms deliberately concealed through that illiteracy. The Kincaid letter ordering the cattle theft would be presented as evidence of a coordinated campaign to destroy the Drummond Ranch, and the testimony of the other Valley families would establish a pattern of predatory lending. Silas read Burke's letter aloud to the family gathered in the parlor. Every word, without hesitation. His voice was steady and certain, the voice of a man who had mastered a skill through sheer will and daily practice. And when he finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. Then he looked at Eliza. "I need to say something to you," he said, and I need to say it now before the hearing, before the winter gets hard, before another day goes by without me saying it." The parlor went quiet. Emmett looked at his hands. Opal, who had been pouring coffee, set the pot down silently. Boone, propped in a chair with his splinted leg extended, went still. "5 months," Silas said. "5 months since you stepped off that stagecoach with a trunk full of books and nowhere in the world to go. 5 months since I asked you to teach us to read. And in those 5 months, you have changed everything. This ranch, my brothers, me." He paused. His hands resting on the table were steady. But his voice, when he continued, was not quite steady, and the slight tremor in it was more revealing than any grand declaration. Because this was a man who controlled himself as a matter of principle, and the loss of that control, even fractionally, meant that what he was feeling had exceeded his capacity to contain it. "I love you, Eliza. I think I fell in love with you at the depot when you declared your education without apology. I love your mind and your courage and your kindness. I love that you rode into a storm for my brother. I love that you sit up late making lesson plans and wake up early to check the accounts. I love that you never once made any of us feel stupid for not knowing what you know." He reached into his vest and withdrew a piece of paper folded into quarters, worn soft at the creases, as though it had been folded and unfolded many times. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward her. "I wrote this. It took me 4 days. I wrote it wrong and crossed it out and started over more times than I can count. But there are things I needed to say that my mouth is not good enough to say. So I used the skill you gave me. I wrote them down." Eliza unfolded the paper with hands that were not entirely steady. The handwriting was large and slightly slanted. Each letter formed with painstaking care, and in places she could see the ghost of erased words beneath the final choices, evidence of a man struggling to find language adequate to what he felt. The words were simple. They were not poetry. They were not eloquent by any academic standard. But they were the most beautiful thing Eliza Thornton had ever read, because every letter had been learned in the past 5 months. Every word chosen by a man who had spent 31 years in silence and was now for the first time speaking in the full and permanent language of the written word. She read them, and she cried. Not from sadness. From the overwhelming recognition that for the first time in her life, someone had used every capability he possessed, including capabilities she herself had given him, to tell her that she was wanted. Not a diminished version of herself, not a quieter, thinner, less educated version. Her, all of her, exactly as she was. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Silas." He stood and crossed to her and took her face in his hands, rough, calloused palms against her soft, wet cheeks, and he kissed her gently, reverently, a promise made without words in the lamplight of the parlor, where his father had died and his brothers had grown, and his life had been transformed by a woman with a trunk full of books and the courage to use them. From across the room, Boone cleared his throat. "About time," he said gruffly. Then to Silas, "You treat her right. She is the best thing that ever happened to this family, and if you make a mess of it, I will break your other leg." Emmett wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and crossed the room to embrace Eliza. "Sister," he said, the word cracking slightly. "Finally, we have a sister." Opal Reeves stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her weathered face, one hand pressed over her heart, and she said nothing at all, because some moments are too full for language, even for a woman who always had something to say. The hearing took place on the third Monday of January 1879 in the Copper Bend Town Hall, a building that served as courthouse, meeting house, and occasional dance hall depending on the day of the week. Judge Ezekiel McAllister presided. He was a former colonel in the Union Army, 70 years old, with a white beard trimmed close and eyes that had seen men die at Antietam and had never fully lost the flinty quality that came from watching the worst of human nature at close range. He was known throughout the territory as a man who could not be bribed, could not be intimidated, and could not be fooled, and his appointment as Justice of the Peace had been one of the few decisions the territorial government had gotten unambiguously right. The town hall was packed, every seat taken, people standing along the walls and crowded in the doorway. The Drummond case had become the Valley's case, and every family that had done business with Cornelius Blaine wanted to see what would happen when someone finally held him to account. Thaddeus Burke, the lawyer from Helena, was a compact, energetic man in his 40s with spectacles and a voice that carried without shouting. He presented the case methodically. The loan documents, the discrepancy between verbal and written interest rates, the pattern of predatory lending across multiple families, the overpayment calculations that Eliza had prepared checked and rechecked until every number was bulletproof. Then the witnesses. Silas took the stand first. He read his own sworn statement aloud, every word his voice steady and clear in the packed hall. He told the story plainly, growing up without schooling, working the ranch from childhood, trusting Blaine because the bank was an institution and institutions were supposed to be trustworthy. Learning to read at the age of 31 because a woman from Boston with more courage than anyone he had ever met showed him that it was possible. He did not ask for pity. He stated facts. This happened. Then this happened. Then this happened. The lack of emotion in his delivery was more powerful than any plea could have been because it forced the listeners to supply their own outrage, and self-generated outrage burns hotter and lasts longer than the borrowed kind. Boone followed. He stood with his cane, his massive frame filling the witness area, and he told the story of the day he signed the loan, how Blaine had hurried him, how the banker had watched him grip the pen incorrectly, had seen the labored childlike signature, and had said nothing. How Blaine had clapped him on the shoulder afterward and called him a fine businessman, and how Boone had walked out of that office feeling proud of himself for handling something his sick brother could not handle, never knowing that he had just signed away the family's safety. He knew I could not read, Boone said, looking not at the judge but at Blaine, who sat behind his lawyer with the rigid posture of a man maintaining composure through sheer will. He knew it. He looked me in the eye and he knew, and he let me sign. Emmett presented the financial records, the ledger that Eliza had designed and that he had maintained with meticulous care for months, every entry, double-checked, every calculation verified. He walked through the numbers with quiet confidence, showing the overpayments month by month, the cumulative total of $412 that had been extracted through a fraudulent interest rate. Then Burke called the other families, Roscoe Tanner, the Whitfields, the Pattersons. One by one they took the stand and told the same story in different words. Could not read, trusted the bank, signed what they were told to sign, paid what they were told to pay. Never knew until Eliza Thornton came to their kitchen tables with her pencils and her patience and showed them the truth written in their own contracts. Blaine's lawyer attempted to argue that the contracts were legal, that the signers had accepted the terms voluntarily, that the bank could not be held responsible for the educational deficiencies of its clients. The argument was technically sound. It was also exactly the wrong argument to make in a room full of people who had been cheated and knew it. Then Burke presented the Kincaid letter. He read it aloud. The cramped handwriting of Virgil Kincaid ordering the theft of Drummond cattle, the price per head, the delivery location, the initial VK at the bottom. Kincaid was not in the courtroom. He had not been seen in Copper Bend for weeks, and his ranch was reportedly being managed by a foreman, while Kincaid attended to business in Helena. But his absence did not diminish the impact of his words on paper. Blaine's composure, already strained, cracked visibly when the letter was read. He leaned forward and whispered urgently to his lawyer, and the whisper was loud enough for the front rows to hear fragments. Not my doing. I had nothing to do with that. Judge McAllister listened to everything. He took notes in a small, leather-bound book. He asked questions that were precise and devastating, the questions of a man who had spent a lifetime separating truth from the various disguises it wore. When all testimony was complete and all evidence presented, he sat for a long moment in silence, his pen, still his white bearded face unreadable. Then he spoke. This court finds that the loan contract between Cornelius Blaine and the Drummond brothers contains provisions that are unconscionable. The interest rate of 14% was materially different from the rate verbally represented, constituting misrepresentation. The penalty clauses in the vague seizure provision were designed to exploit the known illiteracy of the borrowers. The contract is hereby modified. Interest is recalculated at the legal standard rate of 6%. Overpayments totaling $412 are to be refunded in full. The seizure provision is struck and declared void. McAllister paused. The hall was so quiet that Eliza could hear her own heartbeat. Furthermore, the judge continued, and his voice took on an edge that cut through the silence. This court orders a full audit of all lending contracts issued by Cornelius Blaine's bank within this territory. The pattern of evidence presented today suggests systematic predatory practices targeting illiterate borrowers. The territorial marshal will be notified, and the matter of cattle theft documented in the Kincaid letter will be referred to federal authorities for criminal investigation. He closed his notebook. He looked at Blaine with the cold, steady gaze of a man who had seen corruption before and never tired of destroying it. Mr. Blaine, you built your business on the ignorance of honest people. That business is now finished. This court is adjourned. The sound that went through the hall was not applause. It was something deeper, a collective exhalation, the sound of an entire community releasing a breath it had been holding for years. Then the noise came, voices rising, people turning to each other, hands reaching out to grip other hands, and in the middle of it, at the table where the Drummond brothers sat with their lawyer and their evidence and their hard-won literacy, Silas reached under the table and took Eliza's hand. He did not speak. He did not need to. The grip of his fingers around hers said everything. And Eliza held on and closed her eyes and let herself feel for just a moment the full weight of what they had accomplished. They had saved the ranch. Not with guns, not with violence, with words and numbers and the trained mind to use them. On the ride home, Silas stopped the wagon at the crest of the hill, where the whole ranch spread out below them in the winter light. The house and barn and fences, and 300 head of cattle on snow-dusted grassland, the mountains standing guard behind it all. He looked at Eliza. He did not say anything grand. He simply nodded a single slow nod that carried the weight of everything he felt, and everything his father had asked of him, and everything that had nearly been lost. Eliza nodded back, and they sat together in the cold, bright air, looking at home. The wedding was held 3 weeks later on the second Saturday of February in the small white church at the edge of Copper Bend. Snow lay thick on the ground and the mountains stood sharp and white against a sky so blue it looked painted. The church was plain wooden pews, worn smooth by years of use, a single stained glass window behind the altar that threw colored light across the floor in the late morning sun. It was not a grand church. It was not a grand wedding. But every pew was full. They came from across the valley. Ranchers and homesteaders, shopkeepers and tradesmen, families with children bundled in wool coats, and old men with hat brims crusted in ice from the ride. They came because the Drummond name meant something in this territory, had meant something since the boy's father first drove his stakes into the frozen ground and declared that this valley would be home. And they came because the story of what had happened at the cattle sale and the hearing had traveled through the community, changing everything it touched. Eliza wore a dress that Opal had helped her alter white cotton with lace, at the bodice simple and clean. She had pinned wildflowers in her hair, dried winter blooms that Emmett had found pressed in a book and presented to her that morning, with a grin and a bow that made her laugh despite her nerves. She carried no bouquet. Her hands were steady at her sides as she walked down the narrow aisle, and she kept her eyes on Silas, who stood at the altar with his brothers flanking him and his face showing an expression she had never seen on him before. It was not his usual careful control. It was something unguarded and luminous. The face of a man watching the best thing in his life walk toward him and hardly daring to believe it was real. Emmett stood to Silas's left, his eyes bright with unashamed tears. He had spent the morning alternating between singing hymns at the top of his lungs and weeping into his coffee, and Opal had finally told him to either compose himself or go stand in the barn until the ceremony started. Boone stood to Silas's right, leaning on a cane because his leg had healed, but not completely, and his face wore the particular expression of a man who was determined not to show emotion and was failing spectacularly at it. His jaw was set like iron, but his gaze, those fierce Drummond eyes that had once looked at Eliza with such hostility, was suspiciously bright. The preacher, Reverend Alden Marsh, was a lean, weathered man who had come to Montana from Ohio 15 years ago and had married more couples and buried more dead than he could count. He spoke simply about partnership and respect, about two people choosing to walk the same road, not because the road was easy, but because the walking was better together. His words were plain. They landed true. When Silas slipped the ring onto Eliza's finger, a simple gold band he had ridden 2 days to Helena to purchase, because Copper Bend's general store did not carry anything he considered worthy. His hand was perfectly steady. His voice when he spoke his vows was the voice of a man who meant every syllable the way he meant a handshake or an oath on his father's grave. Then Boone stepped forward with his gift. He held a wooden frame hand carved from pine, the edges smoothed and shaped with the careful precision of a man who was better with his hands than with words. Behind the glass was a single sheet of paper, and on that paper, in Boone Drummond's large rough handwriting, was a poem, Longfellow. The passage that Eliza had taught Silas on the porch that autumn evening, when the light was golden and something between them had shifted. Boone had copied it word by word, letter by letter, the handwriting uneven, but every character correct, and he had decorated the border with small drawings of wildflowers, clumsy and earnest and unexpectedly beautiful. Wedding present, Boone said, his voice clipped with the effort of keeping it level. He held the frame out to Eliza without quite meeting her eyes. You taught me to read. I do not have money for a proper gift. This is what I have. Eliza took the frame. She looked at the handwriting at the hours of midnight, practice it represented, at the stubborn, fierce love for his brother that had driven this man to sit down with aching hands and copy a poem he could barely read 6 months ago. She looked at it, and the tears came quiet and unstoppable, rolling down her cheeks, while the congregation sat in a silence so deep you could hear the candle flames guttering in the draft from the door. It is the most beautiful gift I have ever received, she said. Boone nodded once sharply and stepped back to his position. He did not trust himself to speak again. But Emmett put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed, and Silas looked at his brother with an expression that held a lifetime of shared history, shared loss, shared survival, and a gratitude that would never need to be spoken aloud because it existed in a language older than words. The celebration at the ranch afterward was warm and loud and full of food that Opal had been preparing for 3 days. Neighbors brought dishes and bottles and good wishes. Children ran through the house and the yard, and the sound of laughter rang off the mountain slopes. Roscoe Tanner, the old rancher who had been the first to demand his contract be read at the cattle sale, shook Silas's hand with both of his own and said, Your father would be proud, son, of the ranch, of the woman you married, and most of all of the man you have become. As evening fell and the guests departed into the cold blue dusk, Silas and Eliza stood on the porch of the main house that was now truly theirs. The sky was enormous and salted with stars, and the snow on the mountains glowed faintly in the last light. Are you happy? Silas asked. More than I knew was possible, Eliza said, leaning into the warmth of him. I came west expecting one life and found something entirely different. Something better. Kincaid did me the greatest favor any man has ever done, Silas said, when he sent you back. If he had kept you, I never would have found you. Then I suppose we owe him a debt of gratitude for his short-sightedness. Silas kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then her lips softly in the cold, still air. Come inside, Mrs. Drummond. It is cold out here, and we have the rest of our lives to look at the stars. The door closed behind them. The lamp in the window burned steady and warm against the winter dark. And the rest, the beginning of everything that their marriage would become, belonged to them alone. The aftermath of the hearing reshaped the valley. Blaine's bank was audited. The investigation revealed fraudulent contracts with 14 families, and the total overpayments exceeded $3,000. Blaine was stripped of his banking license and left Montana Territory within the year, a ruined man whose carefully constructed respectability had been as fraudulent as his contracts. Kincaid fared worse. The federal marshal investigated the cattle theft, and while territorial justice in the 1870s was imperfect and Kincaid was never imprisoned, the evidence was damning enough to destroy his reputation completely. His neighbors stopped doing business with him. His ranch hands quit. Within 18 months, Virgil Kincaid sold his property at a loss and departed Montana for parts unknown. Before he left, he encountered Eliza once on the main street of Copper Bend. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither spoke. Then Kincaid turned and walked away, and Eliza felt nothing triumphant in his departure, only a quiet relief. A new bank opened in Copper Bend the following year, run by a man named Gerald Oakes, who had the novel idea of explaining loan terms in plain language before asking borrowers to sign. Eliza helped draft the standard contract template, and it became a model that other territorial banks adopted. The Drummond Ranch entered a period of growth that validated everything Eliza had calculated and the brothers had worked for. Without the drain of inflated interest payments and underpaid cattle sales, the finances stabilized rapidly. Silas, now reading agricultural journals and scientific papers with genuine comprehension, began experimenting with rotational grazing techniques that allowed pastures to recover and produced healthier cattle. He purchased adjoining land, expanding the ranch to 500 head, and negotiated every contract himself, reading each word before signing his name in the clear, confident handwriting that Eliza had taught him. Boone's leg healed completely by spring, and with it came a transformation that no one had predicted. The weeks of enforced reading during his recovery had unlocked something in him. He returned to his work with horses carrying not just his lifelong instinctive understanding, but a theoretical framework that enhanced everything he did. He developed a method of training based on trust rather than force, working with the animal's nature instead of against it, and the results were remarkable. Horses he trained were calmer, more responsive, more reliable than those broken by traditional methods. Word spread. Ranchers from across the territory began bringing their horses to Boone Drummond, and within 2 years he had a separate business that operated alongside the cattle ranch, earning more per horse than most men earned in a month. He was not a gentleman, he would never be a gentleman, but he had learned through the painful process of his own education that strength without understanding was just force, and force without purpose was just violence. The horses knew the difference. So did the people around him. 6 months after the wedding, Boone rode into Copper Bend for supplies and nearly destroyed a fabric shop. The horse he was delivering to a buyer spooked at a dog in the street, rearing and kicking, and the commotion sent bolts of cloth tumbling from the display outside a small storefront. The owner emerged like a thunderstorm in calico, a woman of perhaps 27, with brown hair pinned up in a practical bun and eyes that flashed with a fury entirely disproportionate to her small stature. "If you cannot control your animal, keep it out of my town," she said. Hands on her hips, chin jutting forward, addressing a man who stood more than a foot taller than her and outweighed her by at least 100 pounds, as though he were a misbehaving child. Her name was Nell Caldwell. She was a widow. Her husband had died of fever 2 years earlier, leaving her with a 4-year-old daughter named Birdie and a fabric shop that barely covered rent. She had kept the shop open through stubbornness and skill, sewing everything from wedding dresses to work shirts, and she had exactly zero patience for large men who let large horses damage her merchandise. Boone Drummond, who made most men step back when he walked toward them, stood in the street with his mouth open and nothing coming out of it. Then he laughed. A real laugh, sudden and startled and genuine, the kind that came from somewhere deep in his chest and surprised him as much as it surprised everyone around him. Emmett, who happened to be in town that day, later told Eliza it was the first time he had heard Boone laugh in over a year. Boone began finding reasons to visit Copper Bend with remarkable frequency. A button needed replacing. A seam had torn. A shirt needed mending. Emmett counted the visits and reported to the family with glee. 7 trips to the seamstress in 3 weeks. Either Boone is the clumsiest man in Montana, or he is courting. Boone proposed to Nell 6 months later on a Sunday afternoon, standing in her shop with Birdie riding on his shoulders and a bunch of wildflowers in his enormous fist. Nell looked at him, looked at the flowers, looked at her daughter's face beaming down from the height of this mountain of a man and said, "It is about time you asked." The wedding was small. Birdie served as flower girl, scattering dried petals with the serious concentration of a child entrusted with important work. Eliza cried through the entire ceremony, and when Silas teased her about it later, she said, "I am not crying because I am sad. I am crying because 6 months ago that man could not read the label on a medicine bottle, and now he is building a family." Emmett's story unfolded more quietly in the way that Emmett himself moved through the world, without drama, but with a steady, purposeful warmth that drew people to him. He had continued writing. What had begun as a ledger-keeping exercise evolved into something more. He wrote about ranch life, about the animals and the land, and the particular quality of Montana light at different seasons. He wrote about the practical challenges of frontier existence, how to build a barn that could withstand a mountain winter, how to dig a well in rocky soil, how to read the signs of weather in the behavior of birds and the color of the sky. His writing was clear and direct and surprisingly beautiful, the prose of a man who had learned language late and therefore used it with the deliberate precision of someone who understood its value. He sent an article to the territorial newspaper. The editor published it. Then another. Then another. Within a year, Emmett Drummond had a regular column, and people across Montana were reading the words of a man who had not known the alphabet 18 months earlier. A young teacher named Louisa Wainwright came to Copper Bend in 1881 to work at the school that Eliza had established on the ranch property. She was 24, serious-minded, with a passion for education that matched Eliza's own. Emmett fell in love with her the way he did everything else, openly and without pretense. And Louisa fell in love with him because he was the only man she had ever met who treated words with the same reverence she did. They married in the autumn. It was by all accounts the happiest wedding Copper Bend had ever seen, mostly because Emmett sang during the reception, and his voice, which had been carrying grammar rules and multiplication tables across the ranch for 2 years, turned out to be genuinely beautiful when applied to love songs. Daniel Drummond was born in April of 1880 on a morning when the prairie was green with new grass and the air smelled of rain and possibility. Silas held his son for the first time with hands that shook despite his best efforts to steady them. The baby was small and red-faced and furious at the cold, bright world, and Silas looked down at him with an expression that Eliza would remember for the rest of her life, wonder and terror and love so fierce it seemed to change the shape of his face. "He will learn to read," Silas whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "He will learn everything. We will teach him. He will learn to read and to rope cattle and to understand mathematics and to read the sky for weather." Eliza said, her hands resting on her still aching body, exhaustion and joy tangled together like thread. "He will have every opportunity we can give him." 2 years later, Rose arrived. She came into the world with less drama than her brothers, slipping into Opal's waiting hands on a cool October evening, while the last light turned the mountains copper and gold. She had Silas's coloring and Eliza's honey blonde hair, and from her earliest days she showed a fascination with numbers that exceeded even her mother's. "That child counts everything," Opal observed when Rose was 3, watching the little girl arrange her wooden blocks in precise mathematical patterns. "Apples on the table, spots on the wall, stars in the sky. She counts them all." "She comes by it honestly," Silas said, looking at his wife. The years moved forward with the steady rhythm of a life built on solid ground. The ranch prospered. Silas expanded the grazing land, improved the breeding stock, and managed the finances with an acuity that made him one of the most respected cattlemen in the territory. He served on the town council, advocating for education funding and fair lending practices. And when people asked how a man who had learned to read at 31 could speak so eloquently about policy, Silas would say, "I know what it costs to be ignorant. That is why I fight to make sure no one else has to pay that price." Boone's horse training business grew into something remarkable. He wrote a manual on his methods, dictating to Nell at first, and then, as his writing improved, doing it himself, spending winter evenings at the kitchen table with a pencil and a stack of paper while Bertie and his own 2 sons played on the floor. The manual was published by a printer in Helena and sold steadily across the territory. A man who had been unable to read a medicine label was now an author whose work was read by horsemen throughout the American West. Emmett became the most published agricultural journalist in Montana. His column was syndicated to 3 territorial newspapers, and his practical advice on ranching, building, and land management was read by thousands. He and Louisa had 3 children, all of whom could read before they started school because their parents' house was so full of books and newspapers, and the sound of reading aloud that literacy was absorbed like sunlight. Eliza's school grew from a Saturday morning class in the ranch parlor to a proper academy with its own building funded by contributions from the family she had helped during the Blaine case. She taught reading and mathematics and science and history, and she accepted any student whose parents wanted them to learn, regardless of ability to pay. The school that Virgil Kincaid's cruelty had indirectly created became one of the finest educational institutions in rural Montana, and its founder was a woman who had been returned for being too educated. In the summer of 1886, when Daniel was 6 and Rose was 4, Silas suggested a trip to Boston. "I want to see where you came from," he said. "I want to understand the place that made you who you are. And I want our children to know that the world is bigger than Montana." They traveled by train. The children pressed against the windows in wonder as the landscape changed from mountains to plains to the green hills of the east. Silas read newspapers purchased at every station, helped Daniel sound out words from the headlines, and explained the geography, passing outside to Rose, who wanted to know the distance between every town they passed and calculated them in her head. Boston overwhelmed them. The crowds, the noise, the buildings pressed together like books on a shelf, the harbor choked with ships. It was everything Montana was not, dense and loud and urgently human. Eliza took them to the academy, where the headmistress, Mrs. Harrington, greeted her with genuine warmth. "My dear Miss Thornton, or I should say Mrs. Drummond, the girls still speak of your mathematics demonstrations. We have missed you." When Silas shook his headmistress's hand and spoke with quiet courtesy about the education his wife had provided to their community, Mrs. Harrington's initial surprise at his rough appearance gave way to visible respect. This was not the uneducated frontiersman she had expected. This was a man whose intelligence was evident in every sentence, whose self-education was a testament to the very principles the Academy existed to promote. They visited museums and libraries. They attended a lecture at Harvard where Silas asked a question about agricultural economics that made the professor pause and reconsider a point he had just made. Daniel and Rose absorbed everything with the hungry curiosity of children raised by parents who valued learning above all else. But when the week ended and the train carried them west, Eliza felt nothing but relief and longing for home. Boston had made her. Montana had completed her. "Did you ever regret staying?" Silas asked on the train, Daniel asleep against his shoulder. Rose curled in Eliza's lap. "Not for a single moment," Eliza said, and she meant it with her whole heart. When Montana became a state in 1889, Silas Drummond was among those who signed the petition supporting statehood. His signature on the document was clear and confident, the penmanship of a man who had practiced every day for 11 years and would continue practicing for the rest of his life. He served in the first state legislature, advocating for rural education and honest banking regulations. And Eliza stood beside him at every session, advising and supporting her mind, as sharp as the day she had first read Blaine's contract at the pine table in the ranch house parlor. The children grew into the people their parents had hoped they would become. Daniel developed a passion for animals and medicine, reading every veterinary text he could find and apprenticing with the local animal doctor during his teenage years. When he was 18, he left for veterinary college in Kansas with his father's blessing and his mother's books, and the letters he sent home were filled with enthusiasm and discovery that made both parents weep with pride. Rose's talent for mathematics surpassed her mother's by the time she was 12. By 16, she was corresponding with the university professors who could not believe that the sophisticated proofs arriving by mail originated from a teenage girl on a Montana ranch. She intended to pursue higher mathematics at a level that would have been unimaginable for a woman one generation earlier, and she credited her mother with showing her that a woman's mind was not a limitation, but a gift. "You taught me that being too smart is never the problem," Rose told Eliza one evening, looking up from a proof she was working on. "The problem is being around people who are threatened by intelligence instead of inspired by it." Eliza looked at her daughter, this brilliant, fierce girl with her father's coloring and her own stubborn chin, and she thought about a depot platform in July of 1878 and a trunk full of books and a man who had said, "Teach me everything you know." "Your father taught me that," Eliza said softly. "He was the first person who was inspired instead of threatened. Everything good in our lives flows from that one choice he made." On a warm evening in June of 1929, Silas and Eliza sat on the porch of the ranch house they had shared for 50 years. The house had changed over the decades. Rooms added porch expanded the original pine logs, now aged to a deep gold that glowed in the evening light. But the bones were the same. The foundation Silas's father had laid. The walls the three brothers had raised. The windows through which Eliza had first seen the Montana sky and understood that she was home. Bookshelves lined every wall of the interior. Some volumes were the same ones Eliza had carried in her trunk from Boston, their spines cracked and pages soft with age and use. Hundreds more had been added over the decades, a library that documented the intellectual journey of two people who had never stopped learning. Silas was 82 years old. His hair was white, his face deeply lined, his hands gnarled with arthritis that made holding a pen difficult but never impossible. His mind was as sharp as the day he had first written his name on a piece of paper in the ranch house parlor and looked at it with wonder. Eliza was 74. Her honey blonde hair had turned silver, and she moved more slowly than she once had, but her eyes behind her reading spectacles were still bright and quick, still capable of spotting an error in a ledger or a flaw in an argument at 50 paces. Inside the house, their children and grandchildren were preparing a celebration. Daniel, now a respected veterinarian running a practice near the ranch, had come with his wife and two children. Rose, a professor of mathematics at a university, had traveled from the east with her husband, a fellow mathematician, and their infant daughter. Boone, 81, and still working with horses, though he moved slower now, sat in the kitchen with Nell and their grown children, telling stories that had been polished by decades of retelling. Emmett, 80, his writing hand finally beginning to fail him, though his mind never did, sat with Louisa and their children, a copy of his latest published article on the table beside him. 50 years, Silas said, his voice still deep, still steady, though it had acquired the slight roughness of age. Half a century since I picked up your trunk at that depot. The trunk full of books, Eliza smiled. The heaviest thing you ever carried. The lightest, Silas corrected, compared to everything you brought into my life. He took her hand. His grip was still strong, still warm, the calluses softer now, but still present, a map of decades of labor written on his skin. I think about Kincaid sometimes, Silas said, not with anger, just wondering if he ever understood what he lost when he sent you away. I think about him too, Eliza admitted, and when I do, I thank him silently for being exactly who he was. If he had been different, if he had valued what I am, I would never have found you. You were too educated for him, Silas said, and you said, teach me everything you know. The best words I ever spoke, before I even knew how to write them down. They sat in the comfortable silence of people who had said everything that needed to be said and could now simply be together, watching the light fade over the land they had built their life upon. Inside, the noise of family laughter and argument and the high voices of grandchildren spilled through the open windows like music. 2 years later, on a winter morning, when the mountains were white and the sky was the pale blue of old ice, Silas fell ill. It was not sudden. His body had been slowing for months, the inevitable consequence of 84 years of hard living on hard land. But his mind remained clear, and he continued to read every day, Eliza bringing him books and newspapers and the letters that arrived from former students and colleagues across the state. On his last evening with his family gathered around him in the lamp burning low, Silas took Eliza's hand and said the words he had said on the very first night on the porch, with the chalk dust still on his fingers and the alphabet still new. Teach me one more thing. Eliza's throat closed. She gripped his hand with both of hers. What would you like to know? Teach me that it is all right to rest, that what we built will stand, that I can let go. The tears came then, the tears she had held back for 53 years, ever since the depot platform, when she had sworn she would not cry. They fell now without shame. You have worked hard enough, she whispered. You built everything your father asked you to build and more. Daniel carries your integrity. Rose carries your curiosity. Boone carries your strength. Emmett carries your voice. The ranch is strong. The school is full. The books are read. Everything you dreamed has come true, and so much more that you never dared to dream. She pressed his hand against her cheek. You can rest now, my love. You have earned it. Silas Drummond died 3 days later, his hand and Eliza's, surrounded by the people he loved, in the house his father had built and his family had saved. He was 84 years old, and he had spent the last 53 of those years reading, learning, growing, and loving the woman who had taught him that it was never too late to begin. Hundreds attended the funeral, ranchers and lawmakers, former students and business partners, people from across the state whose lives had been touched by a man who had learned to read at 31 and never stopped. Boone stood at the graveside with his cane, his jaw locked against grief, refusing to look away. Emmett wept openly and without apology, his wife's hand in his voice finally silent after a lifetime of song. Eliza lived 5 more years. She remained on the ranch, cared for by Daniel and his family, still reading every day, still teaching when she had the strength. She sat on the porch every evening in the chair beside the empty chair that had been Silas's, and she watched the sun set over the mountains, and she spoke to him sometimes in the quiet of the fading light, telling him about the grandchildren's latest achievements, about a passage in a book she thought he would have enjoyed, about the way the grass moved in the wind like water. On a warm June evening in 1936, Eliza Thornton Drummond sat in her chair on the porch with a book open in her lap and the last light painting the mountains gold. She closed her eyes. The wind moved through the grass with its ancient sound, and the stars came out one by one over the valley she had called home for 58 years. She did not open her eyes again. She was 81 years old, and she died as she had lived, surrounded by books and love in the vast Montana sky. At the funeral, Rose stood before the congregation and spoke about her mother. She was returned for being too educated. Rose said, her voice clear and strong, her father's coloring in her face and tears she did not try to hide in her eyes. A man decided that her intelligence was a defect, that her knowledge was a flaw, that her body and her mind were too much. Rose paused, letting the words settle. But my father saw differently. He looked at this woman standing alone at a depot with a trunk full of books and nowhere in the world to go, and he said the words that changed everything. Teach me everything you know, not teach me a little, not teach me what I need, everything. He wanted all of her. Every book she had read, every equation she had solved, every language she had learned. He saw her fullness not as a burden, but as a gift. Rose looked at the congregation, at the faces of people whose lives had been shaped by her parents' legacy. My mother's gift was not just the school she built, or the students she taught, or the contracts she read, or the ranch she helped save. Her gift was the example she set. She showed us that being rejected by the wrong person is not a failure. It is a redirection toward the right one. She showed us that education is not a weapon or a burden. It is a light. And she showed us that the greatest love stories are not built on compromise. They are built on celebration. On two people who see each other clearly and love what they see. She looked at the twin headstones on simple granite, honest words. Silas Drummond, 1847 to 1931. He never stopped learning. Eliza Thornton Drummond, 1855 to 1936. She never stopped teaching. They saved each other, Rose said softly. A mail-order bride who was returned and a mountain man who could not read. They found each other at the moment they both needed it most, and they built a life that honored everything they were. He learned to read because she taught him. She learned what home meant because he showed her. And together they taught all of us that true love does not ask you to be less. It invites you to be more. The wind moved through the valley as it had always moved, carrying the scent of grass and pine and the high, clean air of the mountains. The ranch stood solid against the western slope, its windows catching the afternoon light. The school that Eliza had founded continued to educate children who came from miles around. The books on the shelves of the ranch house library remained read and reread by grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward the tradition of learning that had begun with a piece of chalk on a summer evening in 1878. And sometimes on warm evenings when the sky turned gold and the wind whispered through the grass, people passing the old ranch house swore they could see two figures on the porch. A man and a woman sitting close together, a book open between them, their voices low and steady in the fading light. The mail-order bride, who had been returned for being too educated, and the mountain man who had said, teach me everything you know. Still together, still learning, still home.